The sky over Clearwater County, Montana, was perfectly still for most of that Tuesday night. The stars twinkled, the air smelled of pine and dry grass. Old Farmer Dale Hutchins, as he always did when he couldn't sleep, sat on his porch, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring into nothingness. And then, the sky cracked. At first, it was just a point, a lonely orange speck moving too fast and too erratically for any aircraft Dale had ever seen. It left a burning trail behind it, as if someone had dragged a hot iron across black fabric. Then came the sound, a deep, tearing roar that shook the floorboards beneath Dale's boots and made the windows in his house rattle. His dog, a weary old hound named Biscuit, jumped off the porch and scurried under the truck. Dale stood up. The object crashed somewhere behind the northern ridge. The ground shuddered violently, like an impact from below. A pillar of fire and smoke erupted into the dark sky, orange and red against the backdrop of stars. Dale watched it for a long minute. Then he went inside, grabbed his phone, and called 911. By the time Captain Park arrived, 2 Montana Highway Patrol officers were already standing by the road leading to the ridge. A fire truck was working uselessly on the shoulder, and 3 black government SUVs were parked at various angles in the field. Sarah stepped out of her car and showed her badge to the officer at the rope line. He looked at her badge, then at her face, and silently stepped aside. Sarah had served at Malmstrom Air Force Base for 2 years. She had encountered unusual things before, or at least, that's what she thought. But when she crested the ridge and looked down into the shallow valley, she felt something shift in her chest. What was in the valley was not an airplane. It was huge, about 140 feet from one end to the other, buried nose first into the earth. Its shape didn't match any manual she had ever studied. In places it was smooth, in others shattered, with pieces of outer plating peeled back like a crushed tin can. Strange symbols were engraved along the sides, glowing faintly with a pale blue light that didn't match the fire. The material looked like metal, but it shifted slightly as smoke drifted over it, almost as if it were still alive. No fire crews were approaching. The first responders stood in a wide semicircle at a safe distance, speaking into radios, pointing fingers, some with weapons aimed at nothing. Sarah walked down the slope toward the crash site. She put on her gloves and kept her hand near her holster, but not touching it, behind her. She heard someone call her name, ordering her to wait for the security team. She kept walking. She was 40 feet from the wreckage when she heard the sound. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It wasn't the groan of cooling metal or the hiss of a gas leak, though there was plenty of both. This sound was different. Low, soft, unmistakably alive. Like breathing, as if many people were breathing very carefully and quietly. Trying not to be noticed, Sarah stopped. She looked at a torn section of plating on the left, where a dark opening had formed between 2 mangled panels. The gap was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. She took a step toward it. Something moved in the shadows. Sarah's hand went toward her weapon, but she didn't draw it. She stood very still. The air was cold and smelled of scorched metal and something else, something faint and sweet, like flowers she couldn't name. A hand appeared in the gap. It wasn't a human hand. It was longer than a human's, with 4 fingers instead of 5. The skin was a deep, smooth blue, like the winter sky before sunset. Fingers gripped the edge of the broken plating, and then, slowly, cautiously, a face appeared. Sarah didn't move. The face was humanoid in general form, but the eyes were very large, nearly twice the size of human eyes, and the irises were silvery, catching the firelight and reflecting it with tiny, sparkling glints. The skin was the same blue color as the hand. The creature looked at her with an expression Sarah couldn't immediately name, but she recognized the feeling behind it. She had seen that look on the faces of people pulled from collapsed buildings, on children found alone in disaster zones. Pure terror. From inside the wreckage came new sounds. A low murmur of voices, repeating in one language, insistent and frightened. The figure in the opening turned toward the sounds and quickly said something. A string of syllables that carried no meaning Sarah could process, but it held all the feeling she needed to understand. She was telling the others to be quiet. She was telling them to stay calm. Sarah slowly knelt. Positioning herself lower than the figure rather than over it, she kept her hands in plain view and away from her weapon. She didn't speak, she just waited. The figure looked at her. It studied her face for a long time. Its breathing was shallow and rapid. A deep wound ran along one side of its head, and dark blood, almost black in the firelight, had dried along its jaw and neck. It was wounded. They were all wounded. "Sarah," she pointed at herself. "Sarah," she said quietly. "Sarah," she repeated more slowly and touched her chest. The figure followed the movement of her hand, then very slowly, with the caution of someone disarming something they weren't sure of, touched its own chest. "Zara," it pronounced. The voice was both soft and rough, damaged by smoke or fear, or both. Sarah nodded, her boots crunching on the gravel. One of the patrolmen followed her down. "Captain Park, you need to step away from this. Stay put," she said without turning around. Her voice was level and resonant, the kind that doesn't ask twice. The footsteps stopped. She looked at Zara. Zara watched the patrolman with her wide, silvery eyes. The terror intensified again, and the figure retreated slightly into the shadows. Zara raised one hand palm forward, asking for a moment. She turned just enough to look at the patrolman over her shoulder. "Back!" she commanded toward the ridge. "Tell the others not to approach. No one fires, no one moves without my orders." The patrolman opened his mouth. "I am your senior," Sarah said simply. "Go." The footsteps retreated. Sarah turned back to the wreckage. Zara hadn't fled. Zara was still standing there, watching Sarah with her silvery eyes, trying to calculate something. Trust, perhaps. The odds. Is it worth the risk? Then next to Zara, a smaller figure appeared. It was shorter, much shorter. Clearly a child, with the same blue skin, the same silvery eyes, but a rounder face and a less wary expression. The child looked at Sarah with open curiosity, not fear. That's how children sometimes look at the world, before the world has time to teach them to be afraid. The child looked at Sarah. Then, the child reached out its small blue hand. Sarah felt something move in her throat. She reached out and carefully took the child's hand, the way you take the hand of something precious and fragile. The child's fingers were warm and gripped two of hers. He squeezed once. Zara made a sound, not quite a word, something between a word and a sharp exhale, as if someone had pressed on a wound and the pain escaped through her mouth. Sarah looked at Zara. "I won't let anyone hurt them," she said. She knew Zara wouldn't understand the words. She said them anyway. "None of them, I promise." She pulled out her radio. She held it up so Zara could see it. Then she spoke into it calmly. "This is Captain Park at the crash site. I need medical teams unarmed. Forward immediately. And I also demand that every weapon be aimed away from this wreckage right now. Not lowered. We have survivors, civilians. They are wounded and frightened. Treat them accordingly. If anyone fires without my direct order, I will suggest a court-martial before sunrise. Park, out." There was a long silence on the radio. Then someone said, "Acknowledged, Captain." The child, Kali, didn't let go of Sarah's fingers. Zara slowly stepped out of the shadows into the light, standing fully upright. She was a head taller than Sarah, slender and long-legged, with a quiet grace that couldn't be entirely hidden by the injuries, the fear, and the blood on her face. She said a full sentence this time, deliberately, looking straight into Sarah's eyes. Sarah shook her head softly, showing she didn't understand. Zara raised her hands toward the sky. Then she made a shape with her hands, a curved motion that Sarah couldn't decipher. Then she pointed at the wreckage, at herself, at Sarah, and then back to the sky. Sarah looked at the sky. Then she looked back at Zara. Whatever they were running from, it was up there. Whatever had broken this ship, stained Zara's face with blood, and turned 47 people into refugees in a Montana valley, was still out there in the darkness between the stars. Sarah stared at Zara. "Okay," she said. She didn't know what was coming. She had no idea how large what was coming was, how many ships, how much firepower, how full the danger was. She had no information, but the child was holding her hand, and the woman before her was wounded and standing her ground. And whatever came next, Sarah Park had already made her decision. She stood up, she held Kali's hand and waited for the medical teams to appear on the ridge. Behind her, the rest of the world was waking up. Satellites were repositioning, generals were being woken, government officials were being rushed at high speed into secure rooms in buildings with thick walls and poor lighting. Screens were lighting up in a dozen countries. Voices were being raised. For now, none of that mattered. What mattered was this. A child from somewhere in the stars reached out in the dark, and a human took it. Everything that followed would grow from this moment, from this single small act of reaching across the unknown and finding that someone was reaching back. Sarah Park stood in the smoke and fire, holding Kali's hand. looking at the sky and thinking about what Zara had pointed to. The stars were looking back. They were very quiet, but they wouldn't stay that way for long. The facility they used wasn't designed for anything like this. It was a decommissioned research base in the hills behind Billings, hastily converted in 36 hours into something between a hospital and a diplomatic reception center with a heavy military presence on the perimeter, which those managing the conversion insisted was just a precaution. Sarah thought that was an odd word when 4 Apache helicopters were circling the ridge and there were enough armed soldiers on the ground to hold off a small army. But inside, at least, it was quiet. The Lirati were brought in carefully, on stretchers and on foot. Medical teams worked quickly and professionally. There was one tense moment at the doors when 2 soldiers moved too quickly. The group of refugees panicked, retreating toward the wall. A voice from the back made a sound like a wounded animal. Sarah stood between the soldiers and the refugees, arms spread like gates, until everyone calmed down. After that, the soldiers gave more space. In total, there were 47 of them, 23 adults, 11 teenagers or young people, and 13 children. They had serious injuries that human medical teams struggled to treat because Lirati biology was partly similar to human and partly completely alien. The doctors constantly hit walls, where what should have worked didn't, and what seemed impossible worked perfectly. One of the older Lirati, a quiet man with a long scar across his collarbone, turned out to have enough medical knowledge for both species to serve as a bridge. He and the lead surgeon communicated with gestures and drawings for the first day, achieving results neither could have reached alone. Kali stayed close to Sarah. The boy followed her at a distance, never touching, but always within reach. When Sarah sat down, Kali sat nearby. When she moved to another room, he appeared in the doorway. After 2 minutes, Zara noticed this and watched the arrangement with an expression that Sarah began to understand was the Lirati equivalent of cautious acceptance. Dr. James Ozzie arrived on the second day. He came from Hydro on a military transport, carrying 3 bags and a black eye from walking into a doorframe at the airport because he was reading his phone instead of looking where he was going. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a habit of speaking very quickly when he was excited about something. He had spent 15 years studying theoretical xenolinguistics, which had always been considered a somewhat eccentric field for an academic to spend a lifetime in. And now, he was perhaps the most important person on the planet. He shook Sarah's hand at the entrance and said, "Tell me everything." Before she could even say his name, she told him everything. He listened, his eyes moving quickly. That's how some people's eyes move when they are sorting and organizing information in real time. By the time she finished, he had already taken out a worn notebook and was writing in a short code she couldn't read. "The translation device," he said. "Can I see it?" The Lirati had brought very little from the ship before it became too dangerous to go back inside a few personal belongings, medical supplies they had grabbed in the chaos. And one device that looked like a flat, oval stone the size of a large hand, smooth and dark gray, with small, raised symbols along one edge. Zara held it. She didn't offer it to anyone. James was taken to meet Zara. Sarah watched from afar as he approached. He moved slowly and left his notebook in his bag. He sat on the floor a few feet from Zara, crossing his legs, making himself smaller. He took a small piece of wrapped candy out of his breast pocket, which he always carried with him. He looked at it, then placed it on the floor between them and pushed it slightly toward her, not demanding, just offering. Zara looked at the candy. She looked at James. Then she reached out and took it. James smiled. He pointed to himself. "James." It took 4 days. 4 days of careful, patient work. James spent hours sitting with the translation device, building a bridge word by word, sound by sound. The device was remarkable. It seemed to be actively learning, correcting and updating its model of the new language every few hours, establishing connections, noting patterns. James said it was the most advanced linguistic tool he had ever had in his hands, and that whoever created it understood language in a way human science hadn't caught up to yet. On the 5th day, he and Zara had their first real conversation. Sarah was in the room. She watched Zara's face. When she began to speak, really speak for the first time since the crash, she watched how the tension in the tall blue figure changed and transformed as the words came out and were understood, as the weight of holding the entire story inside without being able to share it finally began to lift. Zara spoke for a long time. James listened and translated, and listened. Other Lirati had come from a planet called Lyra. It was a planet in a system 400 light-years from Earth, orbiting a star that humans had catalogued but never named anything important. Lyra was a peaceful world, not a military power, not wealthy enough to attract aggressive neighbors. The Lirati were scientists, teachers, and builders, a species that had spent centuries developing a deep understanding of the universe and a deep preference for peace. The Vorkai came 12 years ago. The first contact seemed like a diplomatic meeting. 3 Vorkai ships entered the Lyra system and requested a meeting. The Lyratian Council agreed, because that was who the Lirati were. They met, they talked. The Vorkai had very specific requirements: resources, territory, and a certain number of Lirati for service on Vorkai ships as technical workers. The Lirati said, no. The Vorkai returned with 1,000 ships. Zara paused here. Her large, silvery eyes moved to the window and lingered there for a moment. James didn't rush her. Sarah didn't move. Zara said that Lyra burned for 3 days. She said it very simply, the way humans sometimes say the most terrible things in the simplest words, because simple words are the only ones that don't fall apart when you try to use them. The survivors, a small number who were away from the planet on a research vessel, fled. They ran for years, moving between uninhabited systems, never staying anywhere long enough to be tracked. They were headed for a world, a sanctuary, a place they had heard existed at the edge of the neutral zone when their navigation system failed catastrophically, and their engines were damaged beyond recognition, sending them tumbling through several unmapped jump points. They didn't choose Earth. They didn't know Earth existed. They just fell out of the sky in the only direction gravity pulled them, and they were lucky enough to hit a planet with an atmosphere and soft enough ground. Zara looked at Sarah when James finished translating that last part. She said something directly. James translated. She says she regrets bringing trouble to your world. She says she knows what the Vorkai do to those who stand between them and what they want. She says you should send them away before the Vorkai detect the crash signal. Sarah looked at Zara. Tell her we aren't sending them away, she said. James translated. Zara looked at Sarah. Then she said something else. She wants to know why, James said. Sarah thought about it. Because Kali was holding my hand, she said. And because it's the right thing to do. Tell her that. James translated. Zara looked down at her hands for a moment, then she nodded very slowly. A gesture they had learned the Lirati used, just like humans. A political storm was already brewing. Sarah held 2 video conferences that day with people in suits and uniforms who used phrases like assessed, calculated risk, diplomatic responsibility, and strategic vulnerability. Someone on the third call, a man from a think tank whose name Sarah had already forgotten, clearly stated that the most reasonable course of action was to transfer the refugees to a neutral orbital platform and negotiate their status with those who were searching for them. He called it a measured approach. Sarah called it throwing people away. She said it on the conference precisely and clearly, looking straight into the camera. There was silence. Someone else on the call cleared their throat. The next morning, President Amara Dio held a closed-door session with the United Space Council. Sarah wasn't in that room. She sat outside in the hall with James and Kali, who was eating a piece of plain bread and studying the people running past with focused attention, like someone studying a new species. Sarah drank bad coffee. James read, the corridor was too bright and smelled of floor cleaner. After 2 hours and 11 minutes, the door opened. President Dio came out. She was a small woman with a massive presence, the kind of person whose stillness made the air around her organized. She looked at Sarah, then at Kali. The council has voted, she said. The Lirati are under Earth's protection. Full diplomatic status is not up for negotiation. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Kali looked at her face, reading the changes in her expression, and made a small sound that James later called the Lirati equivalent of a question mark. Sarah smiled at him. It's good news, she said. We're staying. It was the evening of the 6th day. On the morning of the 7th day, a long-range scanner on the dark side of the moon picked up a signal of gravitational distortions at the edge of the solar system, the type of signal a ship makes when exiting a long jump. Then 3 more. The duty officer at the scanning station stared at the readings for a long time. He checked them twice, then he took the emergency channel and reported. 3 ships were moving inward on a direct course toward Earth. They weren't running, they weren't hiding, they were moving slowly and purposefully. That's how something comes when it wants to be seen and wants the observer to understand exactly who it is. The 7th day ended very quietly, But the 8th day promised to be very loud. The message arrived at exactly 4 a.m. Eastern Time. It came on all frequencies simultaneously. Radio, microwave, quantum communication bands that humans barely knew existed. It pushed through satellite networks and deep space arrays, and even through old-fashioned radio telescopes that universities kept on small budgets for nostalgic reasons. It played on all channels at once in every language Earth had ever broadcast into space, and in some languages Earth had never used. As if the sender had done its research, the message was simple. It read, "You are harboring property of the Vorkai Empire. You must surrender the Lirati to our ships within 72 hours. Failure to do so will result in the total destruction of your planet's ability to resist. We do not negotiate with primitive civilizations. We do not grant delays. You have 72 hours. That was it. No name, no greeting, no offer of any alternative, just a flat, clean statement delivered with the total confidence of someone who had said the same words many times before and had never received a refusal. Sarah heard the message replayed at an emergency briefing 2 hours later. She sat in a room full of generals, admirals, and government officials and watched their faces while they listened. Some turned pale. Some froze in the posture people freeze in when they are afraid but don't want to show it. One man in the back of the room, a senior defense analyst, put both hands on the table in front of him, as if he needed something solid to hold on to. When it ended, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then everyone started talking at once. The United Space Council called an emergency session 4 hours after the message arrived. It was the largest joint meeting of world leadership in human history, held via secure video link because there wasn't time to gather everyone in one physical room. Heads of state, defense ministers, and military commanders from every nation on Earth were on the screens, and the noise even through translation software protocols was immense. Admiral Chenwei stood at the front of the main briefing room in Geneva and waited for the noise to subside. He was a compact man in his 50s with short, graying hair and the kind of face that had learned for decades not to give anything away. He had commanded Earth's United Space Defense Fleet for 6 years. He had been preparing for something like this for most of his career in the abstract form that military commanders prepare for things they hope will never happen in a concrete form. He waited for the room to be quiet, then spoke. He said that, as of now, Earth had 3 functional space combat ships in operational status, 2 more in various stages of repair at the orbital shipyard, 4 deep space defensive platforms on the lunar surface, 12 orbital weapon platforms, and a significant network of satellite weapon systems that were originally designed for planetary defense against asteroid threats but could be repurposed in theory. He said in theory because no one had ever tested them against something that shoots back. He showed the council the long-range scans of the 3 Vorkai ships. Each of them was about 8 times larger than any human ship. The energy signatures coming from their propulsion systems were immense. The weapons profiles that the scanning array managed to capture during the brief window before the ships began using some kind of interference field were, as he said, without exaggeration, significantly superior to current human countermeasures. Someone on one of the screens asked directly, "Can we beat them?" Chenwei said he did not believe the 3 Vorkai ships were all they would send. He said that based on what the Lirati had shared about Vorkai military doctrine, the first ships were most likely a show-of-force unit, sent to present the ultimatum and confirm the target. If Earth refused, what followed would be much larger. Someone asked again, "Can we beat them?" Chenwei said, "Not with what we have now." The noise returned, this time louder. Sarah sat, listening. She looked at the screens. She looked at the faces of people calculating, weighing, conducting survival calculations against conscience calculations. She had been doing these calculations herself for the past 48 hours and knew what the numbers looked like. She also knew that the numbers didn't tell the whole story, because the numbers didn't account for what it meant to look a child in the eyes and tell him he was being given away. James sat next to her. He leaned over and said quietly, "Some of them will vote to give them up." "I know," Sarah said. "What will we do if they do?" Sarah looked at the screens. "We'll make a lot of noise," she said. But President Dio spoke before the vote. She stood from her seat at the head of the council table and in front of the screens, and she didn't use any notes. She spoke for 11 minutes. Sarah later read the transcript 3 times. Dio's argument wasn't complex. She said that humanity had a history containing many moments where one group of people had been handed over to another group because it seemed easier, safer, or more reasonable than standing in the way. She said that every one of those moments is now remembered as a failure, sometimes a small failure, sometimes catastrophic, but always a failure. She said that Earth's identity as a civilization wasn't built on its technology or military power. It was built on what it decided to do when the choice was difficult. She said that if they surrendered the Lirati to save themselves, they would survive. But something that could not be replaced would be lost, and they would spend the rest of their existence knowing exactly what they had chosen and at what cost. She said she wasn't ready to make that choice. She called for a vote. It wasn't unanimous. 14 members of the council voted to surrender the refugees. Sarah noted their names. She didn't plan to do anything with the list. She just noted them. The rest voted to stay. President Dio immediately authorized military preparations. Admiral Chen Wei left the room almost at a run, which was the fastest movement Sarah had ever seen. Emergency production orders were sent to all shipyards and manufacturing plants in the orbital network. Defensive platforms were placed on combat alert. Satellite weapon systems were taken out of test modes and configured for active combat operation. Reserve pilots were recalled. Every military unit in every branch of every nation began executing its specific part of what the General Staff was already calling Operation Stand. At the complex in Billings, Zara heard the result of the vote through James. She froze when he finished translating. Then she turned to the other Lirati and spoke quickly and clearly in her language with such confidence that everyone in the room, human and Lirati, straightened up. Sarah watched the group as they listened. Some looked shocked, some frightened. Several of the elders looked as if they were trying very hard not to show they were crying. Then Zara turned back to Sarah and James. She spoke and James translated. She says the Vorkai will not accept the refusal. She says they will come with much more than 3 ships. She says, no planet has ever rejected them and survived. Sarah nodded. We know. Zara spoke again. She says, James said carefully, that the Lirati have spent 12 years running from the Vorkai, and they know their ships, their tactics, and their weaknesses better than anyone living. She says, if you are going to fight, they want to help. Sarah looked at Zara. Tell her, yes. The next 48 hours were the most intense anyone at the complex could remember. Lirati engineers who had been resting and recovering suddenly had work to do, and the change in them was noticeable and immediate. They worked side by side with human engineers, bridging the language barrier with the translation device and James, drawing schematics on digital boards, pointing at screens, and talking rapidly. Vorkai ships had specific structural vulnerabilities in their engine compartments that their shields didn't fully cover. Vorkai communication frequencies could be disrupted in a way that temporarily blinded their targeting systems. Vorkai commanders were trained to expect organized military resistance and were much less prepared for regular or unexpected tactics. None of this by itself was enough, but it was more than nothing. And in the situation they were in, more than nothing was the difference between a plan and having no plan at all. At the 58th hour after the message arrived, 14 hours before the deadline, Admiral Chen Wei sent a reply. Earth's response was broadcast on the same frequencies as the Vorkai message. It, too, was short. It read, the people you are looking for are under the protection of Earth and the human species. They will not be surrendered. If you approach this planet with hostile intent, we will defend it, and them with everything we have. We do not surrender the innocent. Come and try. The response was signed by President Dio, signed by the entire United Space Council except for the 14 who had voted otherwise, translated into all Vorkai language frequencies on which their ships were broadcasting. On the Vorkai flagship, somewhere between the orbits of Saturn and Jupiter, Supreme Commander Vitae read the response 3 times. He had received refusals before, a handful of them from small civilizations with more ego than common sense. At the very beginning, before the Vorkai had built the reputation that made refusals almost impossible, those civilizations had now disappeared, turning into ruins and cautionary tales that served a useful purpose in galactic history. Vitae wasn't angry. He didn't feel anything he would call emotion toward this response. He simply adjusted his calculations, sent new signals back to the home fleet, and requested additional ships. What returned wasn't 3 ships of additional force. 12 more returned. The 12 Vorkai warships began their final approach to Earth, moving slowly, purposefully. like a door closing when someone very large and very confident is pushing it. On Earth's orbital defense network, all screens lit up simultaneously. Sarah stood in the main command center in Geneva and looked at the dots on the display. 12 of them. Each massive, each weapon system aimed at the planet she was standing on. She looked at the display for a long time, then she looked out the window. Outside was a clear European morning, cold and bright, and the sky was the same blue it had always been. She thought of Kali. She thought of Zara standing in the firelight with blood on her face and no longer having anywhere to run. She straightened her shoulders. The countdown in the corner of the tactical display showed 11:44. They had work to do. The first Vorkai ship crossed the threshold of the orbital defense at 9 a.m. No warning shot, no final demand, no ceremony. They came in formation, 12 ships stretching out in a wide crescent. Their hulls dark gray and massive, moving with the slow confidence of those who had never been stopped. The flagship of Supreme Commander Vitae was in the center of the crescent. The largest of them, about 400 meters from its blunt nose to the engine compartments, leaving behind a faint purple energy exhaust from its weapon systems warming up for combat. On Earth's tactical screens, Admiral Chen Wei watched their approach. He had 3 combat ships, and the rest of his plan had to work because the combat ships alone wouldn't be enough. He had told himself this many times over the last 40 hours. Not enough had become his mantra. The pressure he fought every time he wanted to hesitate. Not enough. Not enough meant nothing, and nothing was what he had. He opened the tactical channel. All stations, we are now in full combat status. Orbital platforms, fire at will on my command. Satellite network confirmed. Real-time targeting. Lunar defense array. Initiate final warm-up sequence. All pilots, your briefings are final. No changes. He paused. This is what we trained for. Do your job. Chen Wei, out. The first shot came from the Vorkai fleet. It was a directed energy weapon, a beam of concentrated plasma the color of a bruise, aimed at the primary orbital weapon platform over the Pacific. The platform's shield held for 3 seconds, which was 2 more than the engineers had promised. And then, it didn't hold. The platform exploded in a silent flash of white light. Chen Wei didn't flinch. He had already accounted for this in the plan. "Mark," he said, and the satellite network opened fire. Humans had been putting things into orbit for decades. Communication satellites, weather satellites, scientific observation platforms, debris tracking systems, solar array systems. When the Planetary Defense Agency began its quiet work of converting part of this infrastructure into a weapons network, it did so without fanfare, and the result was a network of firing positions that the Vorkai scanners hadn't fully cataloged. 237 individual systems opened fire simultaneously, targeting the approaches. The Lyra engineers had identified weak points in the Vorkai formation's shields on the flanks. Most of them dealt limited damage. Some hit. The Vorkai formation broke slightly. The ships adjusted, recalibrated, covering each other. Tessa's voice rang out over their command channel, ordering the formation to strengthen and a sweep of the satellite network to be conducted. 11 Vorkai ships began systematically destroying Earth's orbital assets, burning them out of the sky one by one. This was supposed to work. That was the trick of the satellite network. It didn't need to win, it needed to occupy. While 11 ships were dealing with the satellite network, one ship was now slightly separated from the formation. Chen Wei's 3 combat ships struck it from 3 directions simultaneously. Earth's warships weren't Vorkai-class ships. They were smaller, faster, built for the type of combat that relied on mobility and multiple angles of attack rather than brute firepower. The crews inside them were equally terrified and focused, and they flew as if they had nothing to lose, which in a practical sense, they did. The cumulative impact of 3 simultaneous strikes on a ship that had briefly lowered its formation shields was significant. The Vorkai ship didn't explode, but it banked heavily. Its engines shut down, and it drifted out of the fight for repairs. The Vorkai regrouped. They didn't panic. They weren't afraid. But they hadn't expected such resistance from a single, non-aligned planet. And in the Vorkai tactical computers, a small recalibration was occurring. This wasn't a fast suppression of a primitive civilization. This was costing something. Vitae found it slightly interesting in an academic sense. It didn't change the outcome. He ordered a sustained bombardment of the lunar surface to destroy the defense array. The lunar array had already fired. 6 nuclear warheads, modified using Lirati propulsion technology, attached by human engineers who had worked 36 hours without sleep, reached the Vorkai fleet about 3 times faster than Vorkai targeting systems expected. 4 were intercepted, 2 were not. One hit the edge of a middle Vorkai ship and tore off part of its plating. One didn't hit anything, but passed so close to the flagship that the entire command deck Vitae was on shook violently, and the lights turned red for a moment. And Vitae recalculated again. He ordered a full bombardment of the planet's surface, targeting population centers. If humans wanted to be stubborn, he would give them a reason for stubbornness. The first strikes hit the coast of Western Australia and the Black Sea region. The energy strikes weren't nuclear in the traditional sense, but their force created shock waves that leveled buildings for kilometers in all directions. Fires started. Communication in those zones was lost. Emergency services were thrown into the fray. Sarah, watching the tactical feed from Geneva, felt her stomach drop. She turned to the second screen. Where are the Lirati volunteers? 4 Lirati had stepped forward the day before. Engineers and 1 former military technical service officer from the pre-war Lyra Defense Force. A quiet man named Aaron who had spent 12 years feeling useless. They were placed with the crews of 2 repaired secondary Earth ships, where they served as tactical advisors, guiding the crews through patterns of Vorkai weakness in real time, using James's translation device live. Aaron's ship is moving. Someone behind Sarah said on the screen that the secondary Earth ship, designated Task Force 3, was doing something unusual. Instead of a direct collision, it was moving along an approach vector that Aaron had suggested. A curved trajectory that kept it below the horizontal firing plane of the 3 Vorkai ships. Simultaneously, using orbital geometry, like a small fish using the shadow under a rock, Vorkai targeting computers were tracking it but constantly losing it in the gravitational interference generated by their own ships bunched together. Task Force 3 reached the position marked by Aaron. It fired 1 focused shot at an angle that no human tactician would have attempted. Too oblique, too specific, aimed at nothing that a human weapons specialist would have identified as a target. Aaron identified it. The connection between the primary shield emitter and the cooling system on the second-largest Vorkai ship, a point that was protected from all sides except for 1 narrow geometric angle that only became available at a certain orbital position. The burst hit. The second-largest Vorkai ship completely lost shields for 40 seconds. Chenwei waited for all remaining weapons on the satellite network that hadn't been destroyed. Both remaining functional combat ships and 2 surviving lunar platform guns all fired on the same ship within those 40 seconds. The ship fell apart. It fell apart slowly, the way large things fall apart with separating and spinning parts and secondary explosions moving through it sequentially. And then it was all over, and the debris field was spreading, and there were 11 Vorkai ships left. The Vorkai fleet went silent for a moment on their command channels. This had never happened in the long military history of the Vorkai in hundreds of campaigns against dozens of species. This specific thing, a Vorkai warship destroyed in combat by a civilization they were suppressing, it had never happened. Not once. Vita sat in his command chair and looked at the tactical display. He marked the loss with 1 entry in the combat log. Then he ordered a full convergence on Earth. All ships, all weapons. Finish it immediately. Burn everything that needs to be burned. Sarah saw the change in formation on her screen. All 11 ships were closing in, moving quickly. "Admiral," she said into her channel. Chenwei's voice returned, very calm. "I see it. We need the backup solution." "I know. It has to be now." "I know, Captain." A short pause. "Bring Zara." Sarah was already moving. The backup solution had been developed over the last 20 hours, quietly between Chenwei and Zara and Aaron and James, drawn on a digital board in the complex's conference room at 2 a.m. while the rest of the base slept. It wasn't a direct plan. It relied on things for which there were no categories in human military doctrine. It relied on the fact that the Lirati knew exactly how command structures worked in the Vorkai, how the flagship communicated with the rest of the fleet, and what happened to Vorkai formation. When the flagship loses the ability to give orders, the fleet freezes. They waited for orders. Doctrine required it. In Vorkai history, a fleet acting without central command had twice caused catastrophic incidents of friendly fire, and the Empire responded by making independent action at the tactical level practically impossible. This was a strength when the command structure was intact. It was a vulnerability when it wasn't. The lie worked like this. Aaron, who she knew the Vorkai flagship was monitoring, broadcast a short message in impeccable Vorkai military dialect, using codes that Aaron had remembered from his time studying captured Vorkai communication records on Lyra. The message identified itself as coming from the Vorkai ship that had been destroyed, which was impossible. But Vorkai communication encryption didn't include self-verification. The message stated that an anomalous weapon signature had been detected moving on a long approach to the flagship, and that the flagship must immediately lower its front shield layer and redirect energy to its rear defensive array. It was an absurd order, a tactical contradiction. Any Vorkai commander with independent judgment would have questioned it. Vitae's tactical computer, operating on strict protocol, marked it as a legitimate priority order from the fleet, requested a 2-minute delay, and redirected the shield energy. The flagship's front shield layer was lowered. Task Force 3 and Chenwei's 2 surviving combat ships had moved for 4 minutes along the approach angle indicated by Aaron. The same geometric thinking that had destroyed the second ship. Using the gravitational interference of other Vorkai ships as cover, when the flagship's front shield was lowered, they were already in firing position. They fired all weapons on all 3 ships simultaneously at specific structural points that Aaron had drawn on the board at 2 a.m. Places where the flagship's internal systems converged, where the engine core met the command architecture, where a focused strike wouldn't just damage the ship, but would destroy its entire energy distribution network from within. The flagship didn't explode in one single, dramatic moment. It died in pieces. Every system failed sequentially. Energy left it like water from a broken vessel. The massive dark shape dimmed first. Then it began to crack. Huge panels of plating separated and spun. Internal fires were visible through the gaps, and then the engine core gave up, and its light was very bright and very short. And then it was all over. Supreme Commander Vitae died in his command chair, looking at a tactical display that had stopped making sense 3 seconds before the end. On the tactical screens in Geneva, Sarah watched the flagship's signal disappear. The room went completely silent. Then Chenwei's voice came over the channel, very level, very controlled. The voice of a man who had prepared himself not to show too much. Flagship destroyed. Confirm. 3 different stations confirmed it simultaneously. The 10 remaining Vorkai ships went silent. Their weapons stopped firing. Their formation, which had been pressing toward Earth with brutal momentum, stopped. The ships were still moving, still functional, but communication between them dropped to 0, as each crew waited for orders that didn't come. 40 seconds passed, then 60. Then the nearest Vorkai ship engaged its side thrusters, changing course not toward Earth, but away from it. The ship next to it did the same. Then the next. An uncoordinated retreat, because there was no command coordination. Just 10 separate groups of Vorkai soldiers making the same individual calculation in the absence of orders, looking at the debris field where their flagship had been, looking at their own damage reports, and deciding that this fight wasn't what it had been planned to be. In 4 minutes, all 10 ships changed course. In 12 minutes, they passed back through the orbital threshold. In 30 minutes, they completely disappeared from the inner solar system. Their engines burned at full capacity toward the outer edge of the system, where a jump point would take them back to Vorkai space. Chenwei sat in his chair in the command center for a while. Then he said very quietly, "All stations, stand down from combat alert, initiate damage assessment and emergency protocols, initiate rescue operations in the impact zones." He paused again. We stood. At the complex in Billings, Zara heard this through James's translation. She sat on the floor where she was standing not because her legs gave out, but consciously, carefully sitting because her body needed a moment of rest. She put her hands on the floor and felt the solid ground of a planet that wasn't hers beneath her palms, and sighed. Kali came over and sat next to her, leaning against her arm, and Zara placed one long blue hand on the boy's head, and neither of them spoke. The damage Earth had suffered was real and serious. The energy strikes on Western Australia and the Black Sea coast had killed hundreds and wounded thousands more. Infrastructure was damaged in 4 different regions. The orbital network had suffered devastating losses. Almost 60% of Earth's satellite infrastructure had been lost or disabled. 3 Earth pilots died in the battle. Their ships were destroyed before the final phase. Their names were announced late in the evening and read aloud in every language broadcast by every station that was still working. Sarah stood in the courtyard of the Geneva complex. When the names were read, she stood at attention. She remained that way until the last name was spoken. Recovery operations lasted for weeks. Full recovery would take years. Economists said this. Engineers said this. People living near the impact zones said things that were more direct, more personal, and more important than any economist's assessment. Sarah heard them, and she didn't argue. The cost was real. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, but the other thing was real too. The galaxy was watching. The Vorkai Empire operated in a region of space containing hundreds of habitable worlds, dozens of civilizations that had long ago stopped believing resistance was possible. The Vorkai reputation was built on a simple premise. There was no point in fighting. The math never added up. No planet could win. No non-aligned civilization could hold out. The right choice was always to negotiate terms of surrender and try to make them as manageable as possible. Earth didn't make the right choice. Earth did something else. Something that was never supposed to happen according to all Vorkai strategic doctrine. And they won. Every species in that region of space received the recording. Some received it through underground communication networks operating in secret. Some received it on open channels that the Vorkai monitored but couldn't fully control. The recording showed the battle, showed the falling flagship, showed the Vorkai fleet retreating from one planet that refused to surrender those it had promised to protect. It was a short recording, 47 minutes. It didn't change anything immediately. It didn't dissolve the Vorkai Empire. It didn't free the worlds already under their control. But something shifted, something that hadn't moved in a very long time, in many places. Sarah was at the complex 2 weeks after the battle when the first message from outside the solar system arrived. It was short and came on a frequency she didn't recognize, translated by James with Zara and the translation device. Simply, "We saw what you did. We didn't know it was possible. We are trying to remember that it is." It wasn't signed. Sarah understood why. In the following weeks, more messages arrived. Some signed, some not, some long, some just a few words. They came from species she had never heard of, from worlds she couldn't find on any human star chart. All of them said, in different ways, the same thing. "You stood, we saw, we are thinking." A formal ceremony was held on Tuesday, 2 months after the battle. It wasn't lavish. President Dio specifically asked for it to be simple. There was a room, people in it, and the right words spoken clearly. The United Space Council officially granted the Lirati full planetary asylum, permanent residency rights, and the beginning of a full diplomatic partnership. Earth was proposed in 3 different regions of the world. The Lirati, who consulted quietly among themselves for weeks, chose a wide valley in New Zealand where the light was similar in quality to what they remembered from Lyra. Or so Zara said when James asked her about the choice. She said it softly, without grief, just as a fact. The way people sometimes carry loss after a long time, not as a wound anymore, but as a truth within which they have learned to live. At the ceremony, Zara and Sarah stood together. Zara gave a short speech in Lirati, which James translated phrase by phrase. She said her people didn't choose to come to Earth. They fell here accidentally, broken, frightened, and hunted. She said they expected to be rejected or surrendered because that was what their history had taught them. She said that what Earth did instead was something for which she had no word in her language, and she had thought about it for 2 months, and she still had no word, and she thought that was right, because some things shouldn't be small enough to fit into a word. The room was quiet when James finished the translation. Then Sarah spoke. She said that what Zara called something she couldn't name, humans called many different things: justice, decency, solidarity. She said that for her personally, it wasn't a complex decision, because a child was holding her hand in the dark, and that was enough. She said she hoped it would always be enough. She said it should be. After the ceremony, Sarah found Kali in the courtyard. He was standing with his face turned toward the sky, as he had more and more often in the weeks following the battle. Now with curiosity, not with fear. The New Zealand day was warm, and the sky was the clear, fresh blue that happens when the air is cold and crisp. Sarah stood next to him and looked up. She thought of the messages that were still arriving from across the galaxy. She thought of Zara's valley and the light that reminded the Lirati of home. She thought of Iran, who had spent 12 years feeling useless and had ended up being more useful than almost anyone else. She thought of the 3 pilots whose names were read on the evening after the battle, and she thought of them with the full weight of what they had given. Something she wouldn't beg for, wouldn't turn away from. Kali looked at her, He said something. Sarah looked at James, who had followed them. James smiled. He says the sky here is beautiful. He says he thinks he likes it. Sarah looked at the sky. Welcome. Tell him it's his, too, James translated. Kali looked at the sky again for a long minute. Then he nodded with a slow, deliberate nod that meant the same thing in Lirati as it did in every human language Sarah had ever encountered. Yes, good, I understand. The midday light was long and golden over the Geneva courtyard, and somewhere between the stars, something was slowly, tentatively changing. As movement always moves at the start, not like a wave, but like a crack in the ice, spreading from the place where something had been heavy and steady enough to break the surface. Earth was that not because it was the strongest, not because it had the most ships, weapons, or power, but because 47 people had fallen from the sky with nowhere to go, and humanity had looked at them and made a choice. That choice was now in the recording, in the messages, in the cracks spreading through the ice, in Kali's eyes looking at the sky without fear. It wouldn't save everyone, not yet, not quickly, but it was a beginning, and beginnings are how everything that mattered had always begun. When one person decided that the right thing was worth doing, even when the cost was real, even when the risk was huge, even when the easiest, safest, and most reasonable thing was to turn away, humanity hadn't turned away. The stars remembered, and somewhere in the darkness between them, people who had been silent for a very long time were, very quietly, beginning.